Welcome to the Learn Podcast, Liburd.
Thank you for inviting me.
DT Liburd is author of I Want to Go Yellow. Now, many people, if they could, I believe that they would admit that there's an underlying longing and search for true fulfillment in work. Would you say that that's the grand theme in your novel?
Kind of. I mean, there are a few themes, but to give it a context, one of my favorite authors is an individual called C.S. Lewis, and on the back of the book is a quote from C.S. Lewis, which I think underpins maybe the grounding of the book. It says, and this is a summary of the quote, not a direct quote. It says, "If I find in myself a desire nothing in this world can satisfy, the best explanation is that I was made for another world." I think oftentimes people have desires and they feel unfulfilled and they don't know why. I believe it's because only God can ultimately satisfy those desires. That's why you see so many rich people, so many famous people. They're rich and they're famous and seem to have everything that this world seems to offer, but they're discontent because ultimately, I believe that our true satisfaction and fulfillment can only come as we surrender ourselves to our Creator. And that's really, even though it's through fancy language and the book's allegorical, that's the ultimate theme, I think, of the book, which is told ultimately is a story of surrender.
Wow. I like that you brought in the Creator, God, into this, because I was going to say you can't really find true fulfillment without having God in the picture. So when you wrote about an adult who wonders to themselves how they got to the point where they let go of all the things that they were once interested in or things that they were once passionate about, I found it interesting because a lot of people, they have an expectation of a promising life when they're young, yet when they grow up, they find that they didn't attain it. So I'm sure some listeners who will listen to this may say to themselves that they've been there too. So I want to know, what do you say to those people that feel stuck doing something that's holding them back from fulfilling what they were actually gifted to do and actually want to start that journey of pursuing it again?
That's a tricky one, that, because I think that's something that I myself, I think, well, put it this way, I find there's a lot of me in the character of Miles Walker in the book. He's not me because I haven't gone into a spiritual realm and done half the things he's done in the book. But I feel he is me in so much as I would respond to the things he went through in that kind of way if I was him. I think ultimately, a lot of people find themselves in that situation whereby they get to the top of their profession or get high up and look around and somehow it doesn't feel the way they thought it would. Because ultimately, we're looking for fulfillment in physical things. We're looking for fulfillment, first of all, in our family or in the adulation we get from having attained a certain level, or in finance and what we can do with the finance. And they all give a level of fulfillment. They do. I'm not going to deny that. The thrill you get when you buy a new thing, that's great. But none of those things really last. Whenever you buy a new thing, it's great. You share it with somebody, your best mate or whoever that you want to share with that has that impact. But then the next day after, it doesn't take long for even a big thing to fade away, whether that's children or family or wife or home. If we look for fulfillment in those things, and ultimately, we will ultimately end up unfulfilled. For me, ultimately, it comes down to the issue of surrender. And I do a Sabbath school class at church where I would go through some stuff with some young people. And one of the things I was trying to get across to them was the fact that I don't want you to wait until you're my age before you surrender your life to God. Because if you wait till my age, you've got 30, 40 years of having a life which is less directed and less fulfilled than what it would have been were you able to get to the position of surrendering at a young age, at 20, for example. So for me, it all comes down to, I didn't fully realize this when I was writing it, actually, if I'm going to be perfectly honest. If I can backtrack a little bit to put it in context. When I started writing the book, I didn't intend for it to be the book it became. When I started writing the book, it was just going to be, for me, a story about design and creativity, because design and creativity is my background, my educational background. I did a design degree about 30 odd years ago. I kind of lose track of time a little, back in the early 90s. I did a design degree. So initially, the starting point for me with the book was, I remember as a child, at one time I'd drawn like a big scene or something in the back of one of the church hymnals. One time I'd been a bit idle and I drew like a big scene with buildings and someone shooting something down. I remember it's a big elaborate scene in the back of a book. I remember finding that book sometime later, like years later, as an adult or young adult, and looking at that and thinking I couldn't even imagine being able to have the creativity to even put that scene together anymore, because so much of how life works, how I thought life works, has been rewritten by how my new understanding of how life is. So sometimes as you become an adult, you lose the freedom to think creatively as a child. And that was the starting point of the book. How do we as adults get back in touch with that creativity that we have when we're a child, when we can just believe anything's possible and just go for it? And that was what the book was going to be. And I was a few chapters in, and at a certain point, I feel, and I'm always reluctant to say God told me, because who am I? But I felt impressed that a voice almost saying, "Listen, David, the book's interesting, and don't get me wrong, but there's a different level to this book that I want you to take it in." And I wasn't really keen on that, because I wanted to just write the book I wanted to write. But as he revealed to me the deeper meaning behind something I was writing, it not only made the book significantly more substantial, but it also paved the way for the books that will follow as well. And I'm partway through book number 2, and what may end up being a trilogy. But that's only because I opened myself up to what I believe was what the Spirit was telling me is a deeper meaning behind what I'm doing. So ultimately, it comes down to surrender. Oftentimes, we're afraid of surrendering because we feel if we surrender, then our lives won't be what we imagine they would be. They won't be as fulfilled, that God will have us doing some menial task somewhere that we'll get no credit for. But God's not really about that life. God's really about fulfilling us to the maximum. But the scary thing is, his level of fulfillment, or his idea for fulfillment for your life, may not be the same as what you have in mind. And that can be quite scary for a lot of people. So for so many people, they just don't surrender for years and years and years and years and years. Some people surrender on a deathbed, some people when they're old. And God will still graciously accept their surrender. But it's almost like, well, I'll take it now, but we could have had 30 years of walking together, and that would have transformed your life. And I think that's partly what I wanted to do, and hopefully through different stories and different scenarios and different challenges, Miles, that's a story that Miles is ultimately telling in the book.
Wow, you put that so well about surrendering as soon as possible instead of waiting to the last minute. And when you stated that our idea of fulfillment can look drastically different from what God has been planned for us, like, I could not agree more, because many people know that that's actually what tends to happen. But most of the time, God does give us the desires of our hearts. And hearing you say that there's going to be a second sequel to this book is amazing, because listeners, if you haven't already checked out this book, it is already such a great read. And I honestly want to know a little bit more about it. So tell us what your book's really about.
Okay, well, I'll give you the synopsis without any spoilers. The main character, the main protagonist, is called Miles Walker. Now, the book it operates on 2 levels. It's fantasy fiction on one level. So if you were just a regular person reading it, you would just read it as a fantasy fiction book with a little bit of action, adventure. It's exciting. But if you are of a spiritual disposition, then as you read it, you'll realize there are 2 meanings behind it. So the things Miles goes through, the messages that come through, you'll recognize them as echoes of the Bible, and you'll recognize them as a spiritual journey. So he's going on a journey, but you appreciate on one level, and the other level is definitely a spiritual journey. But he's not necessarily fully aware of it straight away, but he gets challenged in different ways. And as the book goes through, we start to discover, initially, as with most protagonists, we're always on Miles' side. But then we realize that as he goes through, he's made some significant mistakes, and he's not really resolved them. And these mistakes become manifestations that really go to press on him. So in the first place, I can tell you this much without any spoilers. He's a designer. That's the context of him. He's a designer, and he's worked his way up to becoming a senior designer in a car firm. So he's a car designer, and he's got to a position whereby maybe he's in his late 30s. He's doing quite well for himself. He's not at the very height of where he's going to be, but he's where many people will probably aspire to being. And then he finds himself, he's looking around, he's just discontent. And he's looking around thinking, is this really it? Is this what of all the sacrifice and all the effort, what it's for? And almost in response to his inner cry, life in a way conspires to take away from him the very thing that in his heart he said he didn't want, but with his actions he said he wanted, and he ultimately loses his job. So it's almost like sometimes I find that we're in a situation where we need to change, Our lives are at a point when he's saying, but we're so comfortable, we're too afraid to change. And sometimes it takes, in many cases, God to shake us out of our circumstance to get us into a different position because he wants us to do something else, but we're too afraid to walk out of it. So sometimes we might lose a job. Lord, why did we lose a job? And sometimes Lord say, listen, if I don't shake you out of this, you're going to be in this job, still discontent for the next 30 years, and your life won't be as fulfilled. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to give you a little bit of discomfort now. I'm going to shake up your life a little bit. Maybe you'll have a year or two of discomfort, but ultimately, I want to redirect you to a life that's more fulfilling. But Miles doesn't know all this. So all he knows is that being shaken out of something that he'd worked hard to get to. But even his heart, he could admit that this isn't really what I want. And then the knock-on effect of that is that there are issues, very practical issues with his family that start to take a toll on his marriage. So it's written in what I hope would be very real language. Anyone who's married will be able to hear the interactions between the husband and the wife and recognize them. They might laugh because they realize that maybe I had a conversation with my wife yesterday or last week. And so we have the tensions that happen when someone loses their job, and that transpires. And ultimately what happens is that through desperation, he gets sucked into, in essence, the spirit realm. And in this separate realm, that's where he meets apparitions of himself in different ways, and he's tempted and tried in different ways that reveal things about his character, and in essence, our character. One of the readers that I read the book, that he said this to me, which was quite interesting when he gave a review on Amazon. He said, you start off reading about the character Miles, and you're looking at his story, but after a while, you realize that you're not just reading about the character anymore, but you are Miles. And pretty soon, in his words, the reader becomes the main person, and then you start to live the life through his eyes. So hopefully the experience that he goes through, you look at your own life and think, is that me? Have I done that? Have I been this person in different ways? And ultimately, it's a story of sacrifice. But ultimately, there's two powerful forces vying for control of his life, for his soul. But who will he ultimately surrender to? And that's what the story is about. It's about an ultimate story of surrender. Will he surrender to either one? If so, which one will he surrender to? And that's really where the twists and turns of the book take us to. An ultimate story, surrender, but who and how. And there are some apparitions and some manifestations of things from inside of his own mind that become real, that threaten his life and the world. It's kind of apocalyptic in a way, but it's allegorical. So everything that he goes through, somebody could look at that and draw a spiritual point on one level, or just look at it as something interesting, exciting on another level.
Yeah, I like how you put it when you said that it's fantasy. So I would say Christian fantasy. But what's great about your book is that it is such an original piece of work, because I've never read a book and said, okay, this is fictional, but it's also a self-help book. Exactly like that commenter said, this book is like holding a mirror to yourself. It makes you analyze your life, and it helps you ask yourself questions that you really haven't taken time to. And when I was reading about the character's life, I was thinking, wow, he really underestimates himself. And there's a lot of people, even biblical characters like Gideon, that I read about the other day. And the thing with Gideon is God called him to lead armies, to go and fight. Yet Gideon was like, who, me? He doesn't think he's capable of what God has created him to do. And I like the journey that your character takes, which also the reader is going to take, in realizing, hey, maybe I shouldn't underestimate myself. Maybe I have it within me to do what I was created to do. So, yeah. And I want to ask you, what is it that inspired you to write your book?
Well, it came out of, first of all, it's an interesting one. I think there are things which are linked, which are practical, which I think will maybe the listeners will be able to identify with. One of the things I think is really important is that I think you need to be in a position of movement. Creativity comes out of movement, and I'll explain what I mean. At the beginning of the year, I'm the kind of person whereby I have lots of different ideas to do lots of different things, and as soon as I get an idea, I like to try it. Many people have an idea, and they're happy to have an idea, and they have the idea sitting almost like a golden coin or a golden egg that they'll cash in one day, but they never really do. And so they're just happy to have an idea. I'm the kind of person who have an idea, want to do something with it. So at the beginning of the year, I was making scarves, knitted scarves, believe it or not. I'd learned to knit, and whenever I learn a skill, I like to think, what's the most I can do with it? So I started knitting a few years ago, and I built like a knitting brand, and then I stopped knitting for ages, and then last year I restarted, and whenever I start something else, I really go into it, and I was looking into yarns and wools, and I was making different designs. And so my mind was already in a movement, creative space. So out of that creative space where I was already doing something, the Lord just needed to redirect my efforts into a different direction. So one day I was talking to one of my nephews, his name's Anson, and he himself did a design degree maybe 20 years after mine. And he works he's like an owner in a company called Good Start Jones. They make bespoke British bags, handmade. So they design and hand make these bags. So we were talking one day, and it was out of that conversation about creativity that he got my mind thinking. And we were talking about creativity and lost creativity. And because I was already in a position of activity, I was already in a position of creative movement, the Lord just redirected me a little bit. And as soon as I got the idea, which came out of the conversation, he was talking about something he'd seen, and where a little girl said something to her dad one day about, I want to go to yellow. And the dad was trying to explain, well, you can't go to yellow because yellow's a colour. And that's just pricked my mind about the difference between how children and adults think. A child will just have something, and they'll see something in a way which we just don't see. We'll see a logic of, well, you can't do that because of this. You can't go to yellow because yellow's a colour, it's not a place. But then I thought, well, does it have to be? And so I started with that almost dichotomy of, does it have to be a place? Could it be a person? Could it be a thing? Could it be a destination? Could it be a goal? And then from that sort of almost contradiction in terms, that gave me the seed of, well, really the seed which became the book. Does it have to be the way we think? Can yellow be a place? Can it be something else? And then from that context, came this world, which became the book called I Want to Go to Yellow. So it's just really from that one statement they made, that simple idea, that questioning of, well, a child would just say, can I go to yellow? And they'd be genuine, but we'd say, no, you can't. Because as an adult, we've learned that you can't do that. And then here's what gets quite interesting, is that the Bible says we need to become like little children. I don't mean we should be adolescent in our thinking, but the way little children just accept what you say. So a child, if you said something to a child, if a good dad said to a child, at Christmas, I'm going to buy you a bike, that child will start to enjoy the idea of the bike immediately because of the faith they have in their parent, that the parent will do that. So if they say, I'm going to buy a bike, they'll say, oh, I'm going to get a bike. And they'll immediately, the character, everything will change, because in their mind, they're already enjoying the bike, because that's the level of faith they have. And that's, in that way, that's how God wants us to be. So if God makes us a promise, irrespective of whether we see it in front of us, we are to, like little children, almost immediately start to enjoy and celebrate and give thanks, because we haven't seen it yet, because we know who's offered it. And that's really in the way in which I feel we should be like little children. And that was the ingredient that started. I wanted Miles, the character, to reconnect with that sort of childish belief. And ultimately, even though we're talking about creativity, it's a childish faith that I ultimately wanted him to get to, as well as his journey of surrender.
I really enjoyed that part where you mentioned about having childlike faith and living life like you already have an answer to your prayer, because that's what scripture tells us, that God will give us the desires of our hearts, and that if we ask, we will receive. So that's awesome. Okay, guys, I would honestly recommend this book, Of a Man in Search of What Can Bring Him Fulfillment, and D.T. Liburd book, I Want to Go Yellow. So where can listeners get a copy?
Well, it's currently available on Amazon. Amazon's probably the best place to get it, that, because Amazon is pretty much international. But within the next couple of weeks, it will be available pretty much anywhere that sells books. In the UK, it's available from stores called Waterstones and other British places, but it is available. People have bought it in Canada and I think in America. So it's available pretty much anywhere. So if you just Google it, I Want to Go to Yellow, then I think it should come up. But the best place is probably Amazon.
There you go. You'll find all those details in the description box. Well, thank you so much for joining me today.
It's been an absolute pleasure, and thank you very much for inviting me.
And thank you, listeners, for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to like, subscribe, and share.